welcome on behalf of the Crossroads Cultural Center. A special thanks to the World Youth Alliance, AVSI-USA, and the International Catholic Organization Network, which all helped to organize tonight's event. Aid to developing countries involves an enormous amount of financial and human resources, both in the private and public sector, because it touches on a fundamental aspect that in various degrees is common to all of us, the desire and the impetus to help those in need. Who has never felt compelled to donate something, money, time, energy, to support people in other parts of the world who are less fortunate than us? At the same time, which donor can remain indifferent to how effectively used are the donated resources? In front of often disappointing results, a debate among experts is currently taking place about the effectiveness of international aid and the types of principles and guidelines which are at the base of development. Any approach which does not integrate the complexity of the context and the human factors of those providing and receiving help is now under scrutiny. The purpose of tonight's event is to document the terms of this debate and the new trends which are emerging from it, and to present a case study, that of AVSI and its work in Brazil, which is a successful example of a more integrated approach. We are fortunate to have two very competent speakers. The first one has an impressive bio, and I'm going to synthesize it. His Excellency Ambassador Oscar de Rojas is currently Professor of International Studies at Long Island University. He retired from the United Nations in 2009 after serving for 10 years as Director of the Financing for Development Office in the UN's Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Mr. de Rojas organized the well-known International Conference on Financing for Development held in Monterrey, Mexico in 2002. He was Executive Secretary of the follow-up conference in Doha, Qatar in 2008. Before joining the UN in 1999, Ambassador de Rojas had served for 27 years in the Venezuelan Foreign and Civil Services, attaining the rank of ambassador, and holding senior-level posts in his country's diplomatic missions at the UN headquarters in New York, Geneva, and Paris, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Caracas. Ambassador de Rojas holds a bachelor's degree in engineering and master's degrees in economics and international affairs from Columbia University. He has received numerous awards and distinctions, and in 2004 was named Honorary Consultor to the Vatican Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. Ambassador de Rojas is a former president of the International Catholic Organization Network Board of Directors and is a member of the Crossroads Advisory Board. Our second speaker is Ms. Jackie Aldrete. She is Program Manager at AVSI-USA, the U.S. branch of the Association of Volunteers in International Service, an Italian-based international organization engaged in development and relief in over 30 countries. In this capacity, Ms. Aldrete supports AVSI country offices and local community-based partner organizations for programs largely in Eastern and Central Africa and Latin America. Ms. Aldrete holds an MA in International Relations from the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins and a BA in Social Studies from Harvard University. Now, Ambassador de Rojas.
Thank you very much. Very kind. Well, I hope that you will hear me because we're having this technical difficulty, but anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you to Crossroads, Angelo Sala, the other colleagues for inviting me to be here, to the ICO Center for sponsoring this, and for Holy Family Church for their hospitality, for having us here. So I'm going to talk a little bit in perhaps slightly more general terms, and Jackie will then be coming down to some very specific ones regarding the work of AVSI, particularly in Brazil. So I hope that you will bear with me, but I did want to talk a little bit about the subject of aid, especially how the discussion of the subject has evolved over the last few decades, particularly here in the UN. And it's quite different. We were just talking about that before, from the way we used to discuss it just some years back. And definitely the human factor, which is the theme for tonight's conference, is very much now a part of the discussion, which was not the case just 20, 25 years ago. So let's start by just recalling that even though countries have given aid to other countries all throughout history, it has not always been called by that name. Much less has it been a topic for discussion and for negotiation. Up until about half a century ago, aid was viewed as a tool of foreign policy that states use at their own will, at their own discretion, to further their own interests, period, without the need for any accountability of any kind. It was only in the 1960s when the subject of development became an established matter of study and a topic for discussion and for negotiation among states that we see this issue of foreign aid being identified as such and coming to the surface. In fact, it was given a formal name. It was baptized Official Development Assistance, ODA. That's the name by which aid is really called for. If you look at any of the documents in the UN and elsewhere, ODA, to distinguish it from other types of international financial movements, such as, for example, lending, public and private lending, direct foreign investment, and other forms of capital flows. The subject of ODA quickly rose to the top of the agenda, especially of so-called North-South discussions, with developing countries, as you could well expect, asking for more aid in order to help them with their development plans and objectives. At the second UNCTAD conference, held in New Delhi in 1968, the famous 0.7% target was agreed upon. I'm sure you all know what that means. But in any event, this target, as you know, calls for the developed countries of the North, to provide in foreign aid an amount that's at least equivalent to 0.7% of their gross national products. Most countries agreed with this target. The U.S. was one exception. They never, in fact, have agreed up to this day that there should be any kind of a quantitative target. But most countries did, but that doesn't mean that the target has been reached. In fact, it has been reached probably by only 5 or 6 countries, mostly from Northern Europe. But the European Union as a whole has committed to reaching it within the next 5 years or so, by the year 2015, which is when we're supposed to meet the MDGs that we will talk about in a moment. So even though the 0.7% target is not still universally accepted, nobody disputes any longer that aid is a legitimate subject for discussion, and that both recipients and donors should have something to say about it, both in terms of its quantity and of its quality. More importantly, aid is no longer seen as an exclusively foreign policy tool to be used at will by donors to further their individual foreign policy agendas, but also, if you wish, as a duty to contribute to the common good of the international community. And we'll talk more about this in a moment. But what is different about discussions on aid today from a few decades ago? In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, ODA was seen by many as really the main subject for discussion between developed and developing countries. It was really only around the middle of the 1970s, and to be precise, the year 1974, when developing countries pushed right down here in the UN for the establishment of a new international economic order. I wonder if there's anybody here who can remember that in this room. The NIEO. That the agenda suddenly grew. The agenda for discussion on development grew from just talking about aid to talking about a lot of other things. So there were new issues to be included in the agenda in order to build this new international economic order, which was supposed to bring more justice to the world, such as, for example, the increase in trading opportunities, the improvement in the terms of trade for developing countries, the relief of foreign debt problems, regulations of the behavior of multinational corporations and of foreign investment, and the reform of the whole structural and institutional system of international economic and financial relations, a topic that's very much at the top of the agenda today. Some people call it the international financial architecture. So those of you who have been following this subject for years know that basically this agenda continues to dominate North-South discussions today. Things have really not changed very much from that General Assembly session back in '74 when the proclamation of the new international order took place to now. The agenda is basically still the same. The subjects that I just mentioned are still the ones that are discussed. And why is that? Because the problems are still there. The problems have not been solved. Neither in the area of trade, in the area of finance, in the area of debt, in the area of reforming the international financial system. None of these things have really been formed. There may have been some improvements here and there, but they have not gone away. So, for example, we see some more recent events, more recent conferences that have taken place under the umbrella of the UN, such as the one that you kindly mentioned, the conference in Monterrey on financing for development in 2002, the Millennium Summit held in 2000, where the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, were adopted. If you look at the agendas of these different conferences, you will see that it's basically covering the same old topics. Sometimes the names change a little bit, but they're essentially the same. So the point, nonetheless, to be made is that ODA today continues to be discussed, same as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, but now it's part of a broader agenda, of discussion between North and South, between developed and developing countries. We call it International Cooperation for Development, in that broader agenda, and aid is one very important part of it. Now, how is the importance of the human factor, which is really what brings us here tonight, increasingly acknowledged? I think one very clear sign of how the human factor has acquired more and more recognition is the fact that when we try to measure development and we try to measure the effect that aid has on development, we no longer just look at dollars. We no longer look at indicators such as, for example, GNP per capita, which used to be traditionally the one indicator that everybody focused on. They decided if a country was developed or not developed depending on what was the level of their GNP per capita. Now we look at other things too, that have a more social and human dimension to them. One example is the so-called Human Development Index, which is now constructed by the UNDP. It's issued every year in a report, the Human Development Report. And the Human Development Index brings in addition to GNP per capita, other variables, such as, for example, literacy rates, which gives us a certain idea of the levels of education. It brings in infant mortality, which gives us a certain idea of the levels of health in the country. So it goes beyond just purely economic variables and tries to bring in these other more human elements in. Of course, the HDI is far from perfect, and we still have a long way to go, but these things are not easy. Many see it as a tremendous step forward, and it's increasingly being used as a reference point by both aid donors and recipients. In the beginning, it was very controversial. Some countries didn't even want to hear anything about it, especially if they ranked low in the HDI. They didn't want to hear anything about it. Now it's being accepted more and more. Another important evidence that the world has moved to a more human conception and definition of development is precisely the adoption of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000. As you know, the MDGs, in fact, are all centered on very human and social variables, such as infant mortality, maternal mortality, and health, education, and things of that sort. So they are a far cry from just concentrating on economic growth or growth of GDP per capita. Now, on the subject of the MDGs, as you know, those MDGs were supposed to have been achieved by the year 2015, which is only 4 years away, and all evidence seems to point to the fact that they will not be reached, at least most of them in most countries. Some of them may be reached in some countries, but most of them will not be reached in most countries. And one of the reasons for that is that there is an aid deficit. There is an aid deficit because even though in order to reach the MDGs, countries will have to do a lot of internal effort themselves, a lot of work themselves. As we all know, I mean, development starts at home, and people have to want to develop in order to develop. You can't just expect it all to come from the outside. But nonetheless, you still need help, you still need aid. And there are estimates. Professor Jeffrey Sachs is one of them, as you know, he's a special advisor to the Secretary General, and he's always coming out with his estimates how much more aid we would need in order to meet the MDGs by 2015. And now they're talking of from 100 to 200 billion more per year in aid, especially for the poorest countries of Africa, if we want to meet some of the MDGs. And at the same time, we are seeing how aid budgets are being cut. So it's a very, very bad situation. So the point here is that even if aid itself will not bring about the MDGs will not happen if there is not sufficient development assistance, because that has to be a part of the equation. Another subject that's important and links up with the human factor is the question of accountability, which is rather new. This has happened in the last several years. The evolution of the concept of aid quality, effectiveness, and accountability. In the older days, people didn't talk about that. They just talked about quantity. How much are we getting? How much are you giving? Now we talk about quality. Where is it going? How is it being delivered? So it is widely accepted that the amount of aid in itself will not do the trick. It is also the quality, the conditions, the targeted programs, the means of delivery, the agencies responsible for it, at both ends, at the giving side and at the receiving side, and their control, their monitoring, and accountability. Donor countries themselves have already set up a forum on aid effectiveness, which looks at these things through the OECD, the OECD DAC, the OECD Development Assistance Committee, and more recently, in the UN itself, in the 2005 World Summit, a new body was set up. It's called the Development Cooperation Forum. It's a part of ECOSOC, which meets every 2 years. And this Development Cooperation Forum, or DCF, as it's known by its acronym, has its emphasis on this whole concept of accountability. It's a forum where donors and recipients come together to discuss what's happening with aid, not only in terms of how much are you giving, but what are we doing with it, how are we handling it. So the question of accountability comes very much to the surface there, because both sides have to be accountable for what they give, for what they receive, and of course when they work together, this task can be made much easier. This brings us to the importance of coordination, which is also something that's been very much highlighted in recent years. There are too many very well-known stories of aid money having gone to waste because of bad management, because of lack of coordination, and worst of all, because of corruption. You can't deny that. So some of the enemies of aid use this as an excuse to argue for decreasing aid budgets, saying, well, you know, we might as well not give any aid because it's going to all end up either being lost or stolen. But the truth is that, as anything else in life, mismanagement, waste, and corruption can occur at any link of the process, but this should not lead us to throw aside what is essentially a good and noble endeavor. So what must be done, in my view, is to improve the mechanisms for coordination, for control, for monitoring, to make sure that these bad things don't happen. And this is being achieved, I think, with some success. Again, donors and recipients working together seem to be the key to make this happen. Coordination has also been complicated with the tremendous growth in the number of donors. We were talking about this just a moment ago. Bilateral and multilateral, public and private, governmental and non-governmental, who engage today in foreign assistance activities, particularly in countries that have been affected by disasters and those that go through situations of chronic poverty. This is a very real problem, how to coordinate all of this. The UNDP is trying to play a role in that regard, and one interesting sign of that is the fact that you know that UNDP has a representative in every country that receives at least UNDP aid, it used to be called the resident representative, now it's called the resident coordinator, because they know that coordination is such an important part of their work. So they try to coordinate aid that comes from different agencies. Now, when you go beyond agencies and you go into the whole non-governmental area, then the thing gets even more complicated, because obviously sometimes, you know, independent private donors don't feel any need or obligation to have to be involved in coordinating things with the official donors. So the great number of non-conventional, as we call them, entities, such as NGOs, who are now active players in the aid field, pose additional challenges. And by the way, a very good case was Haiti. A lot of people talk about how, in the case of Haiti, so much aid was wasted after the horrible earthquake last year because there was simply no coordination. There are all these stories of you know, food and supplies and equipment and things that just laid in the you know, airport and in storage areas and were never able to make it to the places and to the people that they were supposed to reach. And a lot of that was blamed. Part of it was because of the lack of the infrastructure that had been destroyed, but also on the lack of coordination. But having said all that, NGOs play a tremendously positive role in many, many cases, and we're going to hear a very good example in just a couple of minutes. AVSI really is exemplary in this field, and we will hear all the very good things that AVSI does. Unlike AVSI, I am sure there are many others. There are new and emerging categories in the field of aid. So just as there are new players in the field of aid, there are also new official donors drawn mainly from the developing world. Countries that were recipients of aid until very recently, and I mentioned, for example, the case of China, the case of Brazil, the case of South Korea, have suddenly now become donors because of their tremendous rate of development. So foreign aid from one developing country to other developing countries forms part of what we term more broadly South-South cooperation. I'm sure you've heard that term, which can encompass many other activities in addition to aid, such as trade, investment, finance, social and cultural exchanges, etc. China is now one of the most important donor and investor countries in several parts of the developing world. And this is a phenomenon that has happened in the last decade. Another area that has garnered a lot of increased attention when we're talking about new categories of aid is something that is called innovative sources of finance. And you may be familiar with that too. By innovative is meant the non-traditional budget type of aid. These sources, as its name implies, come from other places, and they include things as the proposal for internationally levied taxes on foreign capital transactions. In the old days, they used to call this the Tobin tax. Now, nobody calls that anymore because we try to stay away from the word tax. Nobody likes the word tax. But it would be a levy on foreign exchange capital transactions that are very, very small, 0.005%, but that could provide billions of dollars in additional aid. There's also talk of similar levies on the use of carbon products. There's one already in place on the purchase of airline tickets. Some countries in Europe have this already in place. This was a French initiative. And when you go and you buy an airline ticket, they charge you an extra euro or €2, and that goes into a special fund for development, particularly in the field of health. Some people talk about charges with your credit cards. You know, like when you buy with some credit cards now, you get miles for your travel. Well, instead of getting miles, you could have credit cards that were a little percentage of your purchase goes to some kind of a fund for development. So many of these ideas are being discussed now. Some are controversial, like the Tobin tax. Most of them are under intense discussion. And the estimates range very widely as to how much money they can provide. But there is no doubt that if used effectively and widely, these innovative finance could be extremely important in supplementing the traditional style of ODA. Nobody wants to get rid of the traditional style of ODA. We want to supplement it. We want to bring in more. Because remember, we have that aid deficit. We need to get more aid. And and we need to get more aid in a world where everybody's trying to cut down costs and cutting down budgets. So it's a very, very, very complicated situation. And a final word on this innovative finance mechanism, as I said, the one that's already in place on the airline tickets has been geared to the whole sector of health. So that definitely puts a human face on the whole topic of aid. How do we make sure that aid gets to the people? That's another element that we want to make sure that that is part of the equation. No matter where the foreign aid comes from, whether it's from governments, from agencies, from NGOs, even from individual donors, we want to bring the human factor of aid. It is crucial, if we want to bring the human factor of aid, it is crucial that it reaches those for whom it is intended, and that is the people themselves. So this has a lot to do with the subjects of effectiveness, delivery, control, and coordination that we were talking about a moment ago. But it also touches upon other aspects. For example, the principle that small is good, and the principle of subsidiarity, a very important principle. There have been so many positive experiences, for example, in the area of microcredit, which teach us that when you work with individual people, even if it is with small projects and with small amounts of money, it can yield surprising and multiplying results. So the same can be applied to aid. When people in a town, in a village, in a community can sort of touch and feel the assistance that is being given to them, and they are made partners in its delivery and its application, they will probably treasure it more than when it's huge amounts that they are allocated by some distant for impersonal force. So that principle of subsidiarity, which is a very important principle, for example, of Catholic social teaching, that is known as Catholic social teaching, should be applied as much as possible, in my view, to the foreign assistance area, if we want to put in that human face. It will always be necessary to have those huge, big projects, just like steel mills, airports, dams, railroads, but we should never put aside the question of trying to bring it down to the human level, to the local level, to the personal level, in order to put in this personal touch. And one last sort of area I wanted to touch on is the ethical dimension of this whole discussion. Again, drawing our inspiration from Catholic social teaching, and we are in a Catholic church here, that teaching tells us that there is something called the common good. I mean, it's not only Catholics who believe that, many people believe that, but Catholics have spelled it out in a very precise way, that there's a thing called the common good of mankind, to which everybody is supposed to contribute. And the guiding principle as to how everyone should contribute to that common good is the principle of social justice, which is very simple. It's simply that those who have more have a greater responsibility to contribute to the common good than those who have less. It's just as simple as that. So you can apply that to the whole question of aid. The problem is that it's not yet accepted. The principle of the common good, the principle of social justices have been more or less accepted, particularly in the West, at the level of national countries, within national boundaries. People feel within countries that they do have a responsibility for their fellow citizens. That's why people pay taxes in order to pay for welfare projects and things of that sort, social security. But when you come to the international level, you try to take this a step further, and you try to talk about the common good of the human family as a whole, then the thing gets a little bit more iffy, because we are not there yet. The world has not yet taken that step to think that there is a common good, a universal common good, if we could use that term, to which all men and women of the world are supposed to contribute. So the day we come to that, I think, and we apply it to the field of aid, it will make an enormous difference, because we will no longer be talking of aid just because it is in my interest to provide assistance to those that are more needy, but we will be talking that it is in our moral obligation to do so, notwithstanding all the problems that may be associated with giving that aid. So those arguments that we don't provide aid because there is corruption and there's waste and there's mismanagement, in a way, are taken care of. Because, as I said earlier, it would be the same argument that you would use, let's say, I refuse to pay taxes because I know that some people out there are going to abuse social services and they're going to just live on welfare when they could be working. Yes, there are people who abuse the system, but that doesn't mean that you're going to stop paying taxes. You still have to pay taxes, and you have to try to find ways to end those abuses. Same thing applies in the international sphere. There could be aid that is lost, that is wasted, even that is stolen, but that doesn't mean that we should give it. So again, when we take that step in that direction of trying to bring in the concept of the moral obligation that is imposed upon the whole world because of there being a common good that transcends national boundaries, it will make a very big difference. By the way, as you all know, the Holy See, through the Pontifical Council on Justice and Peace, has just come out with a new, very important document 2 days ago on Monday, which has to do with the whole international financial system and the reform of global, they call it global economic governance, which is a topic that's going to be discussed at the General Assembly just about 3 weeks from now. And I think it's an incredibly, very, very strong document. I was just commenting with my colleague from the Holy See delegation before, because they're calling actually not only for this to happen, what I'm saying just now, they're talking about the common good of humanity as a whole, but they're also saying that we actually need a global authority to put this, make sure that this happens, to put this all into place, to govern all this, to coordinate all this. And as you know, this whole question of global governance and global authorities is a very controversial one that a lot of people don't even want to hear about. So the Holy See has come out with this. I think it's a very courageous pronouncement. It's going to be very interesting to see how the debate unfolds and how it will develop. Very final point on this, again, on this question of the moral dimension. The other important, of course, and very inspiring document that we should never lose sight of is the encyclical Caritas in Veritate, which was issued by Pope Benedict XVI a year or so ago, or a little bit more than that, because he also reminds us that when we're talking about these things of social justice and the common good, we need to even go one step even further than that, because he brings in the whole question of charity. So that we have to advocate for these things, not just for the sake of justice, not just for the sake of social justice, trying to build the common good, but we have to advocate for them because we have to bring in charity into the equation. And very beautifully, in words that I could not even try to repeat here, it reminds us that the world where that component is not built into the equation, where you don't have that feeling of charity in it, where you don't have this thing that he calls gratuitousness, which is a concept that I think was sort of coined by him, a beautiful concept that some things should be free. And just like we receive so many free gifts from God, we should also be willing to give freely to others. He says if those things are not there, if those things are not part of the whole equation, then it's going to lose a lot of that human dimension that we want to bring to it. And that document that was issued on Monday talks about this too. It talks about an ethic of solidarity. I found that a very nice phrase, that the world needs an ethic of solidarity in order to be able to surmount these problems, and of course you can definitely apply that to the whole field of aid. So aid and its human factor cannot be discussed in purely material and utilitarian ways. The moral component has to be brought in. It has to be part of the discussion. It has to be a part of the equation. The lack of this ethical approach is what has so often led us to dead ends in the debate. We reach a point where we cannot discuss any longer because we're talking to different languages. So let us try to remedy that as much as we can. And this is the last thought that I wanted to do. Thank you very much.
Everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you also for this opportunity to reflect on our work, my work here at AVSI, and to share some of those reflections with you. In particular, thank you to our friend Oscar ROJAS for sharing his insights with us and for that very fantastic introduction to our case study. Because his historical perspective that he just gave us about the trends in international aid and some of the terms and concepts that we're talking about now, accountability, transparency, well, transparency is kind of related there to accountability, the quality of aid, coordination, all of those are factors which I hope will come through here in this case study. He also helped us understand this topic of the importance of the human factor by explaining how our understanding of development has moved beyond just an economic definition of development, so that the country's developed if they're earning more money and people have more income. To say that now we really it's quite a consensus to look at development and think about education and health and even beyond that, other social factors and social indicators. So that's certainly the context in which we're operating. What I'm going to share with you is getting down a little bit more to the mechanism of international aid and how projects are carried out. And I will try to emphasize the human factor more at the level of how projects are implemented and how aid is used. Okay. So the description of today's events touches upon some of these very challenging questions that any of us who are engaged in this arena of international development must ask ourselves. These questions might be things like, how effective is the financial and material aid that we bring to the developing countries and their populations in achieving our desired impact? In more stark terms, we could ask, are we doing more harm than good? And a corollary would be, when do we know that our programs are effective? When you step back and look at all of the aid that the US and other countries have given over the past 50 years, billions and billions of dollars, the answer to these questions is neither simple nor direct. Many thoughtful and intelligent people are spending a lot of energy trying to come to an answer, but unfortunately, the findings diverge from a clear consensus. The discussion is also very timely, as our speaker said already, because these debates are ongoing now in Capitol Hill, as well as in capital cities around the world, about really what the value of foreign aid is and what to do in periods of crisis. So this evening I would like to share with you how AVSI, an international organization based in Italy, might answer some of these questions drawing from our experience. I'll focus today on a project, or actually a series of projects, carried out in Brazil in the area of urban upgrading. And this case study will demonstrate some essential characteristics of effective programs for reaching defined goals that in turn can lead to social and human development. I hope that through this presentation I'll also make clear the method of AVSI's work. All too often, development programs try to skip over the human factor, the complexity of desires, ambitions, and most importantly, freedom that constitute each unique person and consequently authentic social groups. And instead, we aim for a set of interventions, policies, and resources, succumbing to the temptation to think that a mechanism will be set into motion, leading inevitably to the desired outcomes, no matter how ambitious these outcomes might be. But since what we are talking about is development, or in other words, change, I would posit that a quick look at oneself would confirm that it isn't so simple as a process or a mechanism. I'll begin my presentation here with a quick outline and then an overview of what AVSI does. Actually, before we go on, you can just take a quick look here at the picture so that you have a visual image. What we're talking about is a city of Salvador in Brazil and urban upgrading, which essentially means upgrading these informal slums, housing built over a bay, over water. These are known as stilt houses or pile dwellings of the two, and resettling the population into neighborhoods. So this is basically just what I'll cover. Okay. Okay, so about AVSI. AVSI's focus on long-term development, achieved through close partnerships with communities, families, and individuals. There is a wide range of sectors in which we find ourselves working, which is the result of the openness to the needs which we encounter, as well as the resources and the opportunities that present themselves locally. Underlying everything, AVSI is always concerned about education and basic health as the most fundamental factors of human dignity and development. At the end of the day, what we're interested in is creating the conditions for people, individuals and groups, to become the protagonists of positive change in their own lives. AVSI hopes to put at their disposal the tools, including the relationships, that are useful for this work of building the common good. So why did we choose this case study? This series of projects is a particularly good example of an effective program. And how can we make this claim? We can see impact at various levels. We can see that high impact has been sustained over time and on a wide range of indicators. So not just the economic, but on physical infrastructure, social, health. There's been significant scale up of the project, powered by commitment of a range of stakeholders, including local and national governments in Brazil, as well as the World Bank, and of course AVSI, its committee. And the project has had an impact on public policy, both within Brazil and internationally. Okay, so before I go forward, I wanted just to briefly mention the 5 points of AVSI's method, and these are just kind of concise concepts that we use as our guidelines. And I'll come back to this at the end. But we say that our 5 points are having the person at the center, starting from the positive, doing with others, civil society and subsidiarity, and partnership. Okay, now we're focusing on Brazil. Here you can see the state of Bahia, okay, and the city of Salvador, which is the 3rd largest city in Brazil. Like many cities in Latin America, they're in the second part of last century, there was significant urbanization, very rapid urbanization of the city, leading to high levels of inequality, unemployment, significant housing crisis, right? When the city can't keep up with the number of people entering the city, they have no place to live. And of course, the people most recently entering the city, especially the poor people who come looking for opportunities, looking for jobs, most often find themselves living in the most undesirable lands. And in this case, a lot of undesirable land around the city, including to the point of building their homes over the water. Okay. With, of course, a whole range of health concerns that come with not having sewage and not having electricity and literally living not on hard soil. Okay. It's also important to note that in Brazil is a very socially active country. So there is an important mobilization of the informal groups of populations there. But there's also a history of conflictive relationships between the community and government. Okay, just 2 more maps to, again, give us a visual here. The city of Salvador, surrounded by water. And then this last map here shows the concentration of informal areas. And the circle represents the zone of intervention of these programs. And we can see that 23% of the city's population lives in slums. Okay. Here we just have some before and after pictures before I get into all of the mechanisms of the project, which is quite complicated, so that you can, again, see a little bit better what we're talking about. Up here you can see in 1984. Here's the coastal line with all of this houses over the water. Okay, you can't see very well right now, but obviously degradation of the natural ecosystem in the bay. Okay, by 1996, not too much has changed. There's been some scaling back, but by 1998, you can see this nice road built along the coast, new neighborhoods built on land, and a greatly improved ecosystem. And then in 2003, you can see how the project was scaled up and has continued to work along the coast here of the bay, with a lot more orderly neighborhoods in the surrounding areas. Because what we're talking about here is urban rehabilitation, or slum upgrading, which means a concentrated effort to resettle informal areas and integrate the population into the formal city. And this type of project is easier said than done. And we can see that the government attempted to address this need before AVSI arrived on the scene. In the early 70s, the need was huge, and the government of the city decided to do something about it. Their early investments, which involved relocating these families that were living in these informal settlements, in these pile dwellings, to other neighborhoods, were initially quite successful. They invested a lot of money, built houses for all of these families, broke down the old stilt houses, seemed to be working fine. By 1986, more and more people were moving back into the area, building these houses once again, creeping back over the bay. All the success had been lost, and in fact, this informal complex settlement in the bay had even grown bigger. What do we learn from this? Is that focusing only on provision of infrastructure and housing without involving the people in a significant way, and without attention to the social needs of the community, made this investment unsustainable. And this makes sense to us. It makes sense because we know that community is not created by buildings alone. It takes a social network, services like daycare, health services, and essentially reasons for people to stay together. And also without the effort to build local ownership, the residents saw this project as external and imposed. And so what did people do? Either these invasions were, the invasions after 86, after the initial project, were new people coming to the city, seeing the opportunity to move in, or families who were resettled decided, I'm going to sell my house, take the money that I can get, and move on, do something else. So they saw it as an opportunity in a way to take advantage of what the government was offering, rather than working together and doing something constructive. AVSI began working in the city of Salvador in the early 90s with a project financed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Italy. This effort in the Nuevo Salgado slum was focused primarily on social development and led to the formulation of an urban development plan for the area with a lot of local participation. This plan was submitted to the public authorities and gained their support and additional financing. As I said before, it's important to keep in mind that informal settlers in Brazilian slums are not new to organizing to make their demands to the government known. Yet what began in Nuevo Salgados and was guided by AVSI was a new form of engagement that was much more constructive. In 1994, the state asked AVSI to help carry out a pilot project to address its social and infrastructure development needs in Nuevo Salgados. AVSI set forth a methodology that was purposefully integrated, both infrastructure and social human concerns, as well as the environment as the three key components. The main innovation of AVSI's methodology was the building of relationships with local communities and information gathering to really know the population and their assets, and not only their needs. And this is one methodological point that we always insist on, that no matter how poor and degraded a community might be, there are always assets, because there are people. There are always assets there on which we can build and from which something can grow. And these assets might be the individual people, the families, but they can also be the social groups. Okay, this is just one diagram that was developed by the project in one of the later phases, and I liked it because it gives us a visual of how these different groups work together: the state government, the city, AVSI, the community associations. What doesn't show up very clearly here is the World Bank. The World Bank provided a lot of financing for this project, but so did the state and city, which is definitely a key part of why it was so successful, because the state and city governments were on board from the beginning. And it was their desire, their vision. Okay. Here we can just see the steps of the intervention. As I already mentioned, in 1994, the pilot project, relatively small, 15,000 people benefiting, $14 million as a total investment, right? So also including all of the infrastructure works. Moving up in 2001 with a grant from the World Bank to reaching 135,000 people, and then further on in 2005 reaching 500,000 people. And these two different numbers here refer to the total amount of money put into the project by the governments for infrastructure. And then this figure down below, this Pat's number, is the amount of the World Bank contract to AVSI for the social component, which I'll explain in just a second. So as I said, the contract of the World Bank to AVSI was known as PATS, which was essentially put AVSI in charge of the relationships with the communities, the social and the social development intervention. Now, I did also want to mention that the Brazilian context played an important role in this scaling up, with decentralization and reorganization of Brazil's urban development and management entities, which really facilitated this happening. Now, this type of scaling up with such an involvement of the government isn't very common, but in Brazil it was able to happen. And as you can see, also 70 local associations were considered partners in the project. And I did want to highlight as well the immense challenge here for an organization like AVSI, which has a person-centered approach to move from working with 15,000 residents to then 150,000 to then 500,000. Now this requires a lot of commitment to the methodology and a lot of commitment to the methodology in front of the other partners. So why are we working the way that we're working? That has to be convincing. Just one last map that shows it shows one segment of the project here in the area called Ribeira Sul, some details. And I thought it was also interesting what you can see in this map are two perimeters. If you can kind of see this yellow perimeter, that's called the physical intervention perimeter. That's where the infrastructure works were focused. And then beyond that, there is a red perimeter, which is the social intervention perimeter. So the works with community organizations and the services that they were provided expanded to a community much larger, which we think is important, right? Because it brings these communities into a bigger network, into a bigger community. Okay, and then this is just showing the last phase of the scaling up, again with World Bank commitment through a specific initiative of the World Bank called Cities Alliance, which has a lot of technical capacity for the specific sector of urban upgrading, which is also a unique aspect of the project. And this part of the project is still going on today. It's still not completely finished. Now, looking more carefully at the methodology, these next two slides are useful to see the phases of activities, where we can see clearly the emphasis given to participatory planning with ongoing community follow-up, monitoring, and evaluation. Now, there's a lot of information here. We can see community assessments, infrastructure and town planning, social environmental planning, and plan implementation with these cross-cutting community follow-up and monitoring evaluation. Essentially, this means the community is involved in monitoring how the project is going and constantly giving feedback to the administrators. There's a lot to be said here to go into, but what I thought there were 3 points or 3 decisions that were made by the management team that are particularly interesting to highlight. First, the program managers created a mechanism for small area businesses to compete in public tender of the infrastructure works. This gave an incentive for their involvement and an economic boost to the local economy. AVSI and the state organization called CONDER committed to having offices in the neighborhoods to facilitate and ensure frequent contact and communication with the population. Now, it's a small thing, but when trust and accountability are so essential to the ownership that people feel, it's a way for them to touch and feel the aid, as we heard before. And lastly, a clear decision was made to build upon the assets of the local community-based organizations, rather than start from scratch. So AVSI in the World Bank budget committed 25% of the budget to the social educational programs and activities. Okay. Now I wanted to stop and take a deeper look at what this participatory approach really means in practice. It's a word that you hear a lot, participation. But I wanted to make sure it's clear what we're talking about. 3 points I could say that can help us define participation. First is engaging existing local organizations and recognizing their value. So providing them opportunities to become stronger as organizations, to expand their activities, to have an outlet to voice the opinions of their neighbors, their families, and to monitor the project, and this is really important, and to ensure the maintenance of the new infrastructure and monitoring that new invasions did not occur on the newly protected shoreline. This is only possible if the people really own the project. They care enough about what they were able to achieve together that they didn't want other people to build still houses where they had just worked together to clean up. Involved extensive community meetings and planning sessions and creative ways of involving small businesses and cooperatives. And I think you'll recognize when I discuss the impact of the project that the investment of time, money, and I'd like to also say patience of working with these multiple small groups. This investment up front led to the sustainability of the results. It built increased social capital, local capacity, and greater acceptance and ownership of the project. One example of civil society community organizations is simply a small organization called the Instituto de Cultura. Okay, a very small organization of a few people from their neighborhood, essentially providing, at the beginning, providing dance, cultural activities for kids and for adults. As we know, Brazilians like music. So this is one of the organizations that popped up in the community. Through the project, the resources of the project were able to reach this organization and help them to become more formal, be registered, recognized by the government entities locally, link with other organizations in their community so that they're more aware of what's going on, more aware of what resources are out there that they can tap into. Provided them resources actually to do more activities. So they branched off and started to do more literacy classes, income generating activities with the population, but also simply to participate in the community meetings and to provide that close encounter with the communities themselves. Okay. Here we can just see this little quote that I threw in by the executive director of this Instituto. Normally government support in terms of cash goes to larger institutions. For us, the best way of obtaining support has been to organize ourselves in a kind of network. We're now more aware of the importance of working together rather than merely as individuals. This kind of new sense of the role of an organization in the community. Significant impact is visible. The resettled communities are stable and vibrant. The shoreline of the bay is restored and the ecosystem is in recovery. There were 2 external evaluations done of the project, one by the World Bank themselves and one by an Italian university. And so some of the data that I'll show in the next slides and the pictures come from those studies, and they're all from around 2006. Okay, once again, a picture, and this is more inland, but you can see a mangrove swamp that was completely lost before, was restored. Okay. And you also see new, much more orderly communities connected with basic services. Okay, here again you see, well, you can't really even see where the coastal line is in this picture. These are all the piled dwellings over the water. And here you can see the coastal line, much more clearly marked. These are just some works in construction in progress. Okay, so some numbers here. The infrastructural outputs. We can see over 1,000 piled dwellings, these still houses were removed. About 1,000 families moved into new houses. Other houses were upgraded and improved. The mangrove swamp was rebuilt. Access roads and access to basic services were provided extensively. And again, this within the context of informal urban slums is not an easy thing to accomplish, because it requires commitment of the government and also of the public utilities, or public and private utilities. They're a bit hybrid. But again, their participation throughout the project is what made that more possible. Some of the social development outputs: 73 community-based organizations were strengthened as a result. Many people were trained: social workers, teachers, healthcare workers. Youth participated in sports. So you can see the range of activities that the project was able to support. Again, the idea being to build community and to give the community the opportunity to breathe again, to live. Here we just see the increase in access to services. For example, connection to sewage lines went from 21% to 84% in 2006. These, of course, are some of the new, nice, colorful houses, and a woman and her previous house. Okay, so now we're back to AVSI's method. Now that we've seen the particularities of this case study, I think we can look again at the points of method and understand what's behind these 5 concepts. The person at the center, which means putting the person with his or her links to the family and the community in the driver's seat of their own development, and structuring the program around this. Examples from the project include extensive initial surveys of the area and the engagement of youth in the neighborhood in actually carrying out that work, surveying. Recognizing that the residents are not only defined by one characteristic or need, in this case the need for adequate housing, but instead they're multidimensional, just like you or I. Starting from the positive, valuing the initiatives that have already been born from the communities and working to support and nurture these. Being committed to the ideals of beauty and order, even in the midst of degradation and a lack of resources. Doing with, not substituting big plans imposed from the outside for the ideas and interests of the community, but instead giving time to participatory planning and finding ways to implement with the people themselves, even if this isn't as quick or easy as building something from my idea and from scratch. Subsidiarity, facilitating decision-making and participation by the communities and local groups. And partnership, openness to sharing with all entities interested in learning from and working together. In this case, close partnership with the state government, CONDER, the State Agency for Development, and Cities Alliance, as well as the World Bank, and most recently with the Ministry of Cities in Brasilia, and participating in national and international forums such as UN Habitat. It's exciting to know that there are other applications going on of this AVSI methodology in Brazil, in the city of Olinda, in the state of Pernambuco, one of the poorest regions of the country, as well as in Mozambique, with participation of the Brazilian government as a donor, as our speaker before mentioned, as well as the Italian government trying to do something similar in the urban slums of Maputo. Okay. So in conclusion, I will summarize what I see as some of the main factors that led to the success of this series of urban development projects implemented by AVSI in a range of local actors and government entities in Brazil. What have we learned? To keep social and human development concerns at the same level of priority as physical and economic development. To involve local and community actors from the beginning and to structure the project around close relationships with them. Not to give lip service to the people, but instead to build relationships based on respect and trust, and to promote a positive and constructive attitude towards reality. To begin small and to scale up when results have been demonstrated, and the capacity, financial capacity, as well as human and political will, is there to do so without sacrificing the methodology. To engage multiple and collaborators in real partnerships. To involve the private sector as a partner and look for ways to stimulate the local private sector. and to use the tools of beauty, order, and dignified work which spark the human desire for ideals. We strongly believe that it's not the amount of money going into foreign aid, which should be the crux of the debate, but instead how this money is being put to use. We feel strongly and know, based on the evidence of our accumulated experiences, that even the best thought-out development programs cannot skip over the human factor, the person, who is the engine of development. An important step for all of us working in this dramatic adventure